for the Japanese water transport code. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about her. You can find out about her in the book if you wish to. Okay, I'm going to focus on Bletchley Park. And of course, here's the story of Bletchley Park as you know it. We have this drummed into us now as primary school children, because that's when they start talking about things. You have to do your little exercise on Alan Turing, also known as Benedict Cumberbatch, also known as Bletchley Park, also known as the Enigma machine. All of these things are conflated into a single concept. It wasn't always thus. Before the Imitation Game movie came out, we knew of Bletchley Park as a place populated by eccentric professorial men like Josh Cooper depicted here, and posh debutante ladies that Commander Denniston had picked up in his golf club, like this lady who I think is probably Sally Norton, photographed by, I can't remember what his name was, the society photographer at the time, I think Deb's Coming Out ball in the early 1930s. So of course, all code breaking women had to wear these sort of elegant dresses. And I will, for those of you who don't really want to sort of hear about women's rights in the 1930s and 1940s, that's fine. I've got some sort of like dressmaker porn for you to study as we go through this. You can just switch off and just look at the pictures. Okay. So this is history's view, historians' view, and you won't be able to read this, the text is probably too small, of what the treatment of women, particularly in the professional code breaking sphere as opposed to the machine operating sphere, was. So there's a letter that was written in 1938 by Commander Denniston, and he says, excuse me, I just have to take my glasses off to read this. I didn't get in touch with any of the ladies' colleges to fill a vacancy because there is one strong candidate, a Miss Egan, who's actually worked here for 3 years and must receive the strong backing of the heads of the sections in which she has worked. And I couldn't face the prospect of having our vacancies filled 100% by women. So clearly Denniston is a misogynist and isn't going to hire any women, not over his dead body. We'll come back to that. And then there's this other one, which this is a mid-war document, dates from 28th October 1942. And this is the head of admin at Bletchley Park, who says, I told Miss Moore, she's the lady at the Foreign Office who's responsible for recruiting women. I told Miss Moore, who's well aware of it, that Hut 6 still prefer girls of better social standing, even though they may not be quite as intelligent. It probably doesn't get any worse than that, but it does get reinforced. And this is a retype done by the GCHQ historian after World War II of World War II documents. Why am I showing you retype? Because it fits on one page. That's the only reason, whereas the original document spread over about 5 pages of foolscap. This is Commander Denniston's emergency list. What's that? Back in 1938, some bright spark thought that Hitler's Germany might pose a geostrategic threat, and therefore it might be a good idea to prepare for war. And part of the preparations for war might be building up a team of standby code breakers who could beef up the bench strength if hostilities broke out. Good idea. It wasn't Denniston's idea, but he was told to implement it. So in implementing it, he produces lists of the people he has approached from the 2 universities. Apparently, there were only 2 universities in 1938, which Denniston ought to have known better, because being a Scotsman, he would have known that Scotland had 1 or 2 of their own. Anyway, there we go. But apparently, there are only 2 universities, and so he went around and he tapped on the doors and got people's names onto his emergency list. And this became known as the list of men of the professor type, quoting from a letter that he wrote in September 1939. If you look at this retype, there are some famous names on there, but fortunately the print is far too small for you to be able to read who they are, but you'll find names like A.M. Turing and J.R.R. Tolkien and various others that you've probably heard of on that list too. That's all quite interesting. And there are 2 women on this list of men of the professor type. He managed to find 2 female professors out of, you know, a list that's well over 50 in length. This clearly shows us, doesn't it, that Denniston is only going to hire men as codebreakers. There's another list at the bottom there, and the heading there is emergency clerical staff, and all the names on that list are names of women. This reinforces our prejudice, doesn't it? That the code-breaking roles were going to be taken by men of the professor type, and menial duties will be carried out by women. Gender divide by occupation. Let us see. Let's start with the photographic evidence. These are photographs taken at Bletchley Park during World War II of people who are not minding machines. Some of them even have Enigma machines on their desks. There are, I think, 2 men in these photos. There's the one standing in the photo bottom left, and I think there might be another one at the back in one of the other pictures. What are these women doing? I mean, they must be making the tea or doing the filing, and what are they doing with an Enigma machine on their desk? That's obviously a mistake. And the photography sort of gives the lie to the official story about the gender division we need to investigate. So what I'm going to invite you to do is follow me through the wardrobe. We'll go into Narnia. We will push the fur coats aside and find out what happened. And we're going to go back to the fur coat era. We're going to go and start in 1919. Okay, in 1919, what is now GCHQ was formed by the merger of 2 World War I era code-breaking organizations. One you will almost certainly all of you have heard of, which is Room 40, the Admiralty's code-breaking division, which had some notable successes in World War I, and many famous Bletchley Park names cut their teeth in that operation. Less well known is MI1B, and these 2 photos on the left were taken as essentially part of the farewell party for the MI1B staff as it merged into the Government Code and Cipher School, later GCHQ. It's quite interesting if you look at those 2 photos that one of them seems to consist entirely of the female staff of MI1B, and then the sort of slightly closer up one has a group of women and a group of men. It's not easy to identify all the characters in this, and we know some of the key figures from MI1B are not shown in these photos, but we do know that this lady is called Emily Anderson. We'll come across her later. She became Bletchley Park's #1 book breaker, and a very, probably the most senior interwar code-breaking professional at GC and CS. There were about a dozen code-breaking professionals in that organization in the mid to late 1920s. She was the only one amongst them who was a woman at the top grade of codebreaker. So that's interesting. And this lady, Clarabelle Sperling, she was recruited from teaching into codebreaking role in World War I, went back to teaching after World War I. So this is basically her farewell party. But she was the top, she was the ace codebreaker. She was the one that came top in the recruitment exams. Yes, you've all seen Keira Knightley doing the crossword in the movie. The recruitment exam in 1917 was a bit tougher than that, and nobody thought you could get top marks in it, and she actually did. I've actually seen the exam. These days they don't actually look that hard. But anyway, there we go. Right. There's also another person, and I can't identify which of these women in this photo it is, but one of these women is a lady called Wendy White. We'll do a lot about Wendy White in the coming pages, but at the point where this photo was taken, she was in probably a clerical role, but by the time we get to the mid-1920s, she's moved in the merged organization into the naval section. So having been in the army codebreakers, she's now part of the naval section, and she becomes essentially the driving force there. The naval section was basically a bunch of public school boys, all right? So they give each other nicknames. And the nicknames are taken from the Rainbow comic, which if you were a schoolboy in the 1920s, you would have got the Rainbow comic, and you would turn the pages to Mrs. Bruin and her chums. Mrs. Bruin is clearly in charge of all these naughty boys. And so Wendy White's nickname in the naval section for GC and CS was Mrs. Bruin. All the boys had the names of all these other cartoon characters. And I picked this one because they're having a lesson on the roof, and so all sorts of things are going wrong. So anyway, let's have another look at Wendy. Here she is in records from 1920, and she's graded. Oh no, that's her seniority date. So this record is from 1922, and she's graded as a shorthand typist supervisor, grade 1. Clearly, she's one of those people who does filing, and on a good day, tea pouring. Here she is again in 1937. The cryptographic staff in the naval section consists of 3 people: Mr. Henderson, Miss White, and in third place, Lieutenant Commander Murray. This is all very interesting. She's the number 2 codebreaker in the naval section by 1937. How does this happen? We don't know. But what it does cause us to do is to look perhaps slightly more skeptically about the job labels and the job descriptions that may not match. Let's have a look at Miss Hazelden. This is a document from 1941. Miss Hazelden works out as much of subtractors as she can from machine sheets of common differences, works out the number of tables of messages, supervises the work of sorting and registering messages, etc. Miss Hazelden is doing punch card code breaking of old-fashioned. This stuff was absolutely ubiquitous during the middle decades of the 20th century. You didn't use Enigma machines. You had code books like dictionaries where you looked up the code sequence, and then you disguised the code sequence by using modular arithmetic and look up another 5-digit number or 4-digit number in a separate table called a table of subtractors. Her job was to work out the subtractors. That's what you call code breaking, 1930s, 1940s style. Okay, Miss Hazelden is a code breaker. Miss Hazelden has been in the office for 6.5 years. Jolly good. She has been an established typist for 4 years. Okay, she's doing code breaking and she's an established typist. Her work is that of a clerical officer. I mean, it gets even more puzzling. I feel very strongly she should be promoted to this grade. Okay, the gradings and the job descriptions are in different universes. And this is something that historians have missed. Let's go back and have a look at that thing which I call the emergency list of men of the professor type. In the original version, there was only 1 woman on it, Miss Dale, and 51 men. And that's in the top part of the list, the male part. And there were 31 women and students in the clerical stuff, the bottom part of the list. Okay, so what's happened by the time those people have stopped being on an emergency list for call up? And let's have a look at the ones that actually showed up. Lots of them didn't show up because they got better offers. Instead of being told, well, there's interesting and mysterious work of a secret nature which I cannot divulge to you, some of them were offered, you know, sexy jobs doing stuff like radar, which you could actually talk about. So quite a lot of them didn't show up to Bletchley Park because they got a better offer. Okay, so who's actually showed up by November 1939? Of the people that are on the top part of the emergency list, 31 men and Miss Dale have showed up. 37 women have showed up. So more women have showed up than men. Oh, well, that doesn't matter because they're all clerical stuff. They're all doing typing and tea pouring and filing. Not so, because in the November 1939 version of the list, they're being given pre-war code breaking grades. So they're not being called typists and clerical staff. These people are being called senior assistants. That's the top grade for a professional codebreaker. And these people are being called junior assistants. That's the lesser grade for professional codebreakers used before World War II. So in other words, there's an equation in Denniston's mind between clerical staff and juniors. This is just how he convinces the Treasury that he can take on 39 or 37 women, because he's going to pay them as if they were typists and clerical staff. He can actually beef up his numbers because these people are paid next to nothing. We will look at how much they were paid in a second. There are also linguists. They're also confusing as well, because there are linguists like Joan Clarke, who, when she, you know who Joan Clarke is. Well, you've met Keira Knightley, so you know who Joan Clarke is. Good, got it. Okay, so Joan Clarke, as we know, is the sort of ace woman Enigma codebreaker on the bomb side of the Enigma work at Bletchley. Joan Clarke's a mathematician. She's hired in 1940 to join the Naval Enigma team. She's hired as a clerical officer, don't know which grade. And they wanted to promote her because she was so good. So she went to talk to her boss, and her boss went and talked to Commander Travis, who was the number 2 at Bletchley Park at the time. And Travis said, well, it's very straightforward. We'll promote her to linguist. So, okay, so Joan Clarke is given a form to fill in, you know, post applied for linguist. Next question, languages spoken, none. Joan Clarke becomes a linguist. Okay. She doesn't speak any languages other than mathematics and English. So it just tells you that what's on the Ronseal test is failed. You'll get that. When I'm talking to an American audience, they haven't got a clue what that means. Okay. No, okay. So it doesn't pass the Ronseal test. So, okay. So Joan Clarke's getting a promotion from a lower grade linguist at £3 a week to, she's going to be paid 15 shillings more, and she's still a linguist. This is the promotion list from 1940. Miss Hazelden, we met just now. She, as we know, is a typist. She's paid 2 shillings and 11 pence, and she's getting promoted still to a typist, but she's getting paid as a linguist. Okay, bonkers, but she does actually speak Spanish, so that's fine. Margaret Rock, she's a statistician. She's one of the Enigma superstars. She's recruited in as a grade 3 clerk, paid 2 shillings and 6 pence. £2 6 shillings, I should say, not 2 shillings and 6, but 2 shillings and 6 pence would be a bit unfair. No, £2 and 6 shillings. And she's getting promoted to linguist, just like Joan Clarke. The only language that she speaks, apart from English, is mathematics. Okay, Margaret Story, she's one of my heroes from the Enigma Traitors book, but Margaret Story, very interesting person. She is a grade 3 clerk at £2, and she's promoted to grade 2 clerk at £2 and 6 shillings. She speaks 9 languages, and she's not a linguist. Okay, point made, I think. And so just who are all these people? We'll be here all afternoon if I give you the full bio details of this, but this is Marie Rose Egan, who is the lady that Denniston wrote that letter about in 1938, saying he couldn't face the prospect of having all his vacancies filled by women because he'd already got her. She's a very impressive person, headed up the air section cryptanalysis work in the Eastern Mediterranean for the first half of the war till Italy was knocked out. This is Emily Anderson, I was just telling you about, chief bookbreaker at in the interwar and during the war years, and had a very interesting CV as well. Margaret Rock, I was just telling you about, Enigma breaker, along with her colleague Mavis Lever, later Mavis Beatty. Between them, these two won the Battle of Matapan by a feat of code breaking. This lady, I had to put her on. I mean, she's actually a very interesting person in her own right. She's the one female man of the professor type on the emergency list, and so very impressive. A classicist of some international renown. But then during World War II, she's put on to Scandinavian codes, naval codes, and then Japanese codes, and she mastered Japanese, which, you know, when you speak ancient Greek and Latin, It's not sort of like obviously that you're going to be great at Japanese. You mastered Japanese in about 4 months. Very impressive woman. And finally, we've got Rhoda Welsford. She's interesting for a number of reasons, but she's one of the people who appeared on the bottom part of the emergency list as one of the emergency clerical staff. But she kind of gave the game away because we knew that she wasn't clerical staff because we knew she'd been a World War I era code breaker. So the fact that she was classified as emergency clerical staff means that it was sort of a bit of a giveaway that the heading on the list was misleading. So she's brought back in to do, pick up where she left off in 1939. And this lady, she's a very interesting character. They picked her out of the British Embassy in Berlin as a German-speaking typist, and she had seen the whole saga of the descent of Germany into hostilities in the period leading up to 1939. She's seen it right there, sitting there in the heart of Germany. And she's recruited into Bletchley Park to work on commercial codes during the war. So I mean, there's all sorts of people. They're all quite interesting. They're all very impressive individuals. All right, okay. So I'm talking to a predominantly male audience. May I point that out? But so all you men want to know what happened to those men of the professor type. You've been banging on about women for the last sort of 15, 20 minutes. Okay, let's have a look at what happened to them. So we started off with 51 men on the emergency list, and we saw that only 31 had actually showed up at Bletchley Park in 1939. What has become of them by 1943? 5 of them have gone into management. 4 of them are doing intelligence work. So they're sifting through the decrypts to tell the generals and the admirals what to make of it. They're not doing code breaking. 11 of them have actually left Bletchley Park. People like Alan Turing have left Bletchley Park by 1943. There's 2 I wasn't able to trace. That leaves 9 out of the original 51 men of the professor type. Only 9 still doing code breaking. And of those, only 3 are still physically at Bletchley Park. Most of them have gone back to London with Commander Denniston to work on non-military code breaking. So there's only 3 men and Miss Dale, the one female man of the professor type, who's still at Bletchley. This is giving us a rather different picture from the one that the historians have given us, which is the code breakers at Bletchley Park were the men of the professor type. No, they weren't. They were the ones who were, the people on the list were the men who had said they were available to be called up. They were not selected on any basis of aptitude or code breaking ability. They just said they were available. And those who were available and showed up and tried their hand at it, the vast majority turned out to be useless. By contrast, the women who were recruited to Bletchley Park were grilled at an interview by Miss Moore of the Foreign Office. We met her a minute ago. And they were selected because they had the aptitude and the skill sets that were necessary to make them good code breakers. So the women actually made better code breakers because the selection process was more orderly, more what we would recognize in the 21st century, not the old boy, well, I'm available and I'm a professor approach of the 1930s. Interesting. So let's go back and try and explain this bizarre comment by Denniston that he couldn't face the prospect of 100% of his vacancies being filled by women. The reason historians haven't noticed this is because people who study code breaking at Bletchley Park are typically military historians, not social historians. So they have overlooked the working conditions for women in the middle part of the 20th century. The number one problem was the marriage bar. What's that? Some of you will remember. Until the end of World War II, it was mandatory for women who got married to have to leave their post in the civil service. they were fired. They were given a generous payoff. It was more generous than if they'd stayed in the civil service and worked until retirement age and drawn their pension, which is interesting. But the fact is, they were sacked. So the reason any employer, male or female, would not want to have 100% of their vacancies filled by women is that lots of those women are going to get married and you're going to have to replace them. And particularly if you're recruiting in the graduate market, the chances are that you'll take on somebody who's 22, and by the time they are 25, they are likely to have gone out of the door, and you'll be placed in exactly the same position as you were this week. You can take the risk with a few people like Miss Egan, but you don't want 100% of your vacancies filled by women. It's just not the way to run your show. Maybe he wasn't being misogynistic. Maybe he was complaining about the social environment in which he had to recruit. Problem goes on, even in mid-war. This is Frank Birch, who's not one of my favorite Bletchley Park characters, but he's quite interesting. He's the head of the naval section by 1943. He has to send in a weekly report to his boss, Commander Travis, and he reports on staffing as he does every week. And on this one, he's saying, love is our fifth column. It leads increasingly to absenteeism, getting married, compassionate leave when husbands have leave, and wastage, resignation on marriage. They're not sacking them because the marriage bar has been temporarily suspended because of the hostilities, but they're resigning because they got married, resignation to have a baby, and resignation to be with husband while he's in the UK. I mean, you know, this is terrible. So even in the war years, the recruitment machine is still having to run year after year because female staff are leaving. Male staff apparently don't turn into absentees when they get married. They don't need compassionate leave because their wives are not serving officers and therefore they don't have home leave, and men are not expected to resign, socially not expected to resign on marriage, and so forth. The social thing is tilted away from women having professional roles. And I think the historians have sort of like overlooked that in the past. All right, so what was it like for these women? Again, I could spend like 2 hours just talking to this slide alone. This is Wendy. We've come across Wendy. Wendy had a run-in with one of the men of the professor type, a chap called Professor Vincent, professor of Italian from Cambridge University, who was put on, well, as you'd expect, he was put on Italian naval codes. I mean, that would be a sensible thing to put him on. Wendy'd been doing Italian naval codes since Professor Vincent first picked up his volume of Dante. Okay. But if you're the Regius Professor of Dante at Cambridge University, you do not like to be told how to do your job by somebody who is a superintendent of typists. This relationship did not go well. She kept complaining, he kept complaining. Eventually, he finds his way into some kind of admin role because he really, I mean, he's not useless at code breaking, but he's not as good as she is. But what happens to her? She doesn't get left alone. She gets pushed off back to London to go and work with Denniston again because she's considered to be a difficult woman, a disruptive force. The phrase difficult woman was used. This is, we'll rejiggle this for an American audience. This is my only American codebreaker that I'm showcasing today. That is Agnes Driscoll. She was the chief naval codebreaker for the US Navy from 1919 right through to about 1942, by which time the organization had expanded massively and they put a naval officer in charge and so forth. So she sort of got subordinated a bit. She broke all sorts of Japanese codes, which were of huge importance in the naval war. We all think about the American attack on Japanese codes as being something to do with a machine called Purple, which was not a naval machine at all. It was a diplomatic machine. So the naval codes were the province of this lady. And so she broke all sorts of things. And then she tried her hand at Enigma. And the sniffy Brits, in the form of people like Alan Turing, didn't respond very helpfully to her questionnaire about stuff while she was trying to get familiarized with the machine. And there was nearly a schism between the US naval codebreakers and Bletchley Park, mishandled on both sides. She wasn't responsible for that. Her reputation was trashed in the 1990s by a chap who was a very senior NSA official called Frank Raven, stellar codebreaker in his own right, who, as a very junior, newly recruited naval lieutenant in early World War II, had been put under this lady who was old enough to be his mother. So, classic 1940s reaction. He doesn't like being told what to do by a woman, even if she is old enough to be his mother. And he dissed her reputation, saying that her solution to the Enigma problem was unworkable, useless, and he had seen right through it from day one and told her so. And he used all sorts of very negative expressions, which you can read in the book, but I'm not brave enough to say out loud because I have things thrown at me. And because he was Frank Raven, they believed what he said, and it became the official story about how dreadful and useless a codebreaker and how difficult a person she was to work with and so forth. And if you start reading accounts from other people, it turns out that Frank Raven made up the story about his solution to seeing through her solution on Enigma as being useless. That wasn't him at all. It wasn't true that she was useless as a codebreaker. It wasn't true that she was an unpleasant person to work with. You just have to be careful which sources you look at. And if you are doing an oral history interview, you need to ask challenging questions, not say, oh yes, Mr. Raven, it's such an honor to be able to take a history from you, which is what they did. So interesting, right. Okay, this lady is Dr. Erika Panvitz. This is one of the bizarre stories of World War II. Not only did the Germans have women codebreakers, the only one of the German codebreaking enterprises, of which there were 6, to hire women as professional codebreakers was the Foreign Office. And you will recall that the head of the Foreign Office was the arch-Nazi Joachim von Ribbentrop. Right under his nose, and in contravention of an edict from 1933, which was that there should not be any professional women in the German civil service, we have so all the women who were in the German civil service was fired in 1933, apart from the women codebreakers. Perhaps it was because it was a secret unit and nobody knew what they were doing. They thought they were making a tea. But Erika Panvitz broke through punch card techniques. She broke the State Department's code called O2 and did various other things. And despite having, let's call it an unconventional lifestyle, the full details of which you can read about in the book, but all the things that you would think would sort of single her out for hostile treatment in Nazi Germany, she seems to have navigated a pathway through all that until it gets to 1945, when she applies for a job in the post-war years to be a maths lecturer at the University of Berlin. And they decided she couldn't have the job because it wouldn't be suitable to put her up in front of a room full of students. So this is really bizarre because it's completely the upside down expectation from what you would imagine that people would be treated like in Nazi Germany and in the liberated Germany. This lady, Patricia Bartley, she was the head of the Bletchley Park, later Berkeley Street unit, breaking German diplomatic codes, had some great successes. And she had a big almighty row with a chap called Frederick Freeborn, who was an employee of the British Tabulating Machine Company, which many of you have actually worked for them or one of their successor entities. Freeborn headed up the punch card unit at Bletchley Park and was not under any circumstances going to be told what to do or what priorities to award to particular tasks by somebody who is a female section head. she had to go to the US to get her punch card solutions adopted by the Army codebreakers of the US Army at Arlington Hall in Washington, because she couldn't get any traction with Bletchley Park. Oh, that's pretty shocking. But anyway, so there's a nice little, there's lots of little stories in there. Okay, fine. How come we didn't know about any of this before now? We have perhaps been looking the wrong way. We have not been assisted by our writers. This little booklet here, which has got the same picture of Anne Cara Christie as I used for my cover slide, is the celebration of women's role in cryptology during World War II. The underlying thesis is kind of given away by the title. The women were there to share the burden. So presumably that was the men's burden that they were sharing. Again, we get this thing. If you were an early visitor to Bletchley Park in the, let's say, 2000s, you might have picked this one up, and I won't tell you who it's by because it is by one of the past presidents of the British Computing Society. Oops, he's no longer with us. So I'm not going to be libelous. It's not technically possible for me to be libelous. I will, however, quote from his book. This book is The Bletchley Park War, Some of the Outstanding Individuals. This book has got pages and pages of little mini bios of the various people that sort of came to his mind. There are 15 biographies of men, and then there's this 2-page spread called The Girls. And I'm going to read to you from the 2-page spread of The Girls. Codebreaking at BP in World War II involved a great deal of clerical work, paper handling, sorting, typing, counting, carrying, indexing, filing, etc. This work became the role of the girls. Let me go blah, 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 blah. Much of the work was repetitive and tedious, but without careful concentration, one careless slip could cause a decryption to fail. Without the ever-willing, meticulous work of the girls, the great feats of BP could not have been achieved. They also served to add the gentle touch to what might otherwise have been a rather arid and all too serious a place. Oh dear. The diminution of the role of women in code breaking continued right through. I mean, this book's only 10 years old, okay, and we have a very respectable modern era historian writing trash like women were seemingly employed more frequently as translators than in cryptanalysis. They tended to occupy junior roles. He just read what's on the tin. He hasn't actually asked himself, does the Ronseal test apply? It's really rather disappointing. All this is just telling me is that all these people who wrote these 3 works, and there are millions of examples I could have cited, just singled these out. Historians see what they expect to see in the archival records. So they're actually looking at everything through a prism of their own sort of social conditioning. We expect to be told that women had subordinate roles during World War II and that the code-breaking professional roles were reserved to men. So, you know, we have to sort of like ask why that happened. So I'm going to introduce you to some female codebreakers now. This lady has made the tea. I mean, clearly it says so. It says so on the tin, actually. So that's quite helpful. What were you supposed to say to your family and friends about what your war work was? And the answer to this question is different according to whether you're a man or a woman. If you're a woman, that's why you won't be asked the question in the first place. But if you are, then you're going to say, oh, well, you know, it's frightfully boring, dear. I sort of, you know, it's like office work. And, you know, occasionally they let me make the tea. and you'd be believed if you said that. So it was a nice, easy cover story for women. Women for 40 years after World War II said that they'd made the tea and everybody believed them. And the men had a point to prove. This is why they started putting recruits to Bletchley Park into uniform midway through the war, because they wouldn't be accused of being white feather, war avoiders, draft dodgers. They wouldn't be accused of that, so they put them in uniform. But for the other lot, particularly the early war recruits, the men of the professor type, when they were asked what they'd done in the war, they hadn't been able to talk about it. So for years and years and years, they'd been compelled to be silent. And in their minds, in their imaginations, somehow they ducked out of the nasty business of World War II. So they wanted to write their memoirs to basically re-establish their own egos. And we have to respect that as a sort of a legitimate thing. So in fact, what that means is that the men are those who come to mind because they're the ones that wrote the memoirs. The women didn't write the memoirs because they'd got away with the excuse of I made the tea and everybody believed them. So that if you look at the memoirs written between about 1980 and roughly 2000, they're nearly all by men, and they're nearly all trying to re-establish their own credibility as somebody who'd done something useful during the World War II period. So the men come to mind. There are more books by them, about them, apart from this lady. This lady is apparently Joan Clark. If you go and look online for an image search for Joan Clark, you'll get this lady who would appear to have been a corporal in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Or you'll get a picture of this lady who apparently filled in a crossword puzzle at some point in order to get a job at Bletchley Park. I have to say to you that neither of these ladies is Joan Clark. Not really, not really. Where this one came from is utterly bizarre. Joan Clark was never in the WAFs, by the way. I mean, there may have been a Joan Clark. I mean, it's a common enough name. So there may have been a Joan Clark who looked like that, but I've shown you the picture of the real one. But this is all very weird. Why does Joan Clark come to mind as likely the only woman codebreaker that anybody outside this room has ever heard of? That's the reason. And why is she in this motion picture of Hollywood? It's because she's there as Alan Turing's sort of, sort of other half, which is just the most weird reason for being able to recall the name of a codebreaker is because they somehow had a relationship with Alan Turing. I mean, that's not a good reason at all, is it? So we owe the women codebreakers a little bit more respect than that, I think. There's another reason why Joan Clark is kind of known to people, and that is because, as I said at the very beginning, there is only one story of Bletchley Park, and it's the Alan Turing is Bletchley Park is the Enigma machine story, which is sort of all this conflated piece of porridge. In other words, Enigma was the only code that was broken. It's not a code, it's a sub. It's the only code that was broken at Bletchley Park. Or if that's not quite true, it's the only one of any significance. It's the only one where we made a big difference because we applied a technical solution to something that hitherto had been squared paper and pencils and, manual, whatever. If you subscribe to that view about Bletchley Park's contribution, there's no point in looking for women codebreakers because you're focused entirely on the Enigma team and probably the Enigma teams in Huts 4 and 8. And you're not actually looking at what happened in the rest of that huge codebreaking empire that took up however many scores of acres and all those hideous brick and concrete blocks that you can still see on the Bletchley Park site. You are ignoring the contribution of breaking German diplomatic codes. You are ignoring the fact that we managed to track down all the German spies that reached our shores and how we actually did that through codebreaking, you are ignoring the fact that most of our intelligence about the Germans came from reading Japanese traffic. You ignore the fact that we actually had a war in the Far East, which involved people losing their lives in things like the Burmese jungle. You ignore the fact that we had a naval war with the Italians that went on in the Mediterranean, which was of huge strategic importance, particularly for the war in North Africa. You ignore the fact that everybody was terrified that Franco was going to come in on the same side of the war as Adolf Hitler, and therefore we needed to know what the Spanish were thinking, and therefore Miss Hazelden's work on the Spanish diplomatic code was actually crucial. We ignore the fact that we had the same problem with the Vichy regime, and we ignore the fact that the Luftwaffe weren't just using Enigma, they were using much lower level codes. All these things had women as the main driving force of the code breaking at Bletchley Park or Berkeley Street, where the diplomatic code breaking took place. And what's that? That's a decrypt. That's a decrypt from October of 1942, and it's one of the spy signals that was decrypted, probably by a woman, though I couldn't tell you which one. They had a whole code breaking section called ISOS, which stood for Illicit Signals Oliver Strachey, but that meant non-Enigma encrypted agent traffic from German spies all over continental Europe. So we were deriving information about the Panzer Army Africa from one of these agents, headed by a woman. Interesting. Why are we so blinded by Enigma that we can't see all this other stuff, which I think is quite interesting, actually. Anyway, right. So because we don't give any credit to what they did, we can't actually see the people that did it. There's another thing, and this gets me on slightly awkward turf. Another reason why we assume that all the women at Bletchley Park had menial roles, and that is because we listen to the survivors. This picture is taken nearly 2 years ago at the Bletchley Park Trust's annual veterans reunion. And as you can imagine, the numbers of veterans has been diminishing over the years. According to Bletchley Park Trust statistics, there were about 400 veterans still with us in 2024, of whom 18 had managed to make it to the reunion, which is pretty impressive. I know that some of the ladies in that picture have since passed, so the numbers are still going down. But if you think about it, the youngest lady in that picture, who's 97, when the war started, she was 12 years old. So by the time she was recruited to Bletchley Park, she was a school leaver. This is the youngest of those. So she was a school leaver. You're not going to put a teenage school leaver with no experience of anything at all onto the most high-level professional code-breaking task. You're going to put her onto minding a machine. Of course, I don't belittle the work of minding a machine, but because we've listened to survivors' stories for 20 years or so now, we have been selecting for ourselves a group of storytellers who were the people who were machine minders just because of their age, not because of anything else. The more senior women will have passed earlier and been less likely to move into the freedom of expression era where they could actually talk about their roles. And of course, lots of them have got so used to talking about, I just made the tea, that it was kind of, they didn't feel that they needed to tell their story anyway. So different from the men thing. So we have a sort of, every year when you pick up the newspaper and you read an obituary of another Bletchley Park codebreaker that's passed, you will read a story about somebody who had a relatively low-grade job because they were a teenager when they were hired there. And that's not anybody's fault, but it just serves to reinforce this idea that, oh yeah, well, of course, all the women have menial jobs, and all the interesting stuff was done by the men of the professor type. There are a number of other reasons, but I'm not going to bore you to death by going on to it anymore because I can see that I'm running out of time. We need some time for questions. So I'm just going to leave you with the idea that, as the fashionistas put it, there's a right way and a wrong way of doing things, and it's not always as it seems. Right, okay, I'm just going to do one last thing before I take questions, and I think Delwyn's going to do something technical while I do this. I'm going to explain what this is about. This is a shameless plug, because you were kind enough to be my audience. At the National Museum of Computing, we have launched something this year to celebrate the 90th anniversary of Alan Turing's paper on computable numbers, which you all had to study when you were doing Computing 101, and you probably detest, as many technical folks that I've come across in the computing industry, into a business meeting in Brussels, and this guy says, "I hate you." I've never actually met this person before in my life. He says, "I hate you." I said, what have I done? And he says, "It's that relative of yours that wrote that bloody paper, and I had to read this. I had to understand it when I was doing Computer Science 101." And so, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't write it." So anyway, so we're celebrating on computable numbers with an application to the Intelligence problem, a whole series of fun stuff that we're going to be doing at Bletchley Park and in association with Bletchley Park. And I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of things. First of all, go have a look at the museum's website and find the little tab at the top that says Computable 90, and then you can find out all the things we're doing. There's going to be a conference which is going to be the world's leading mathematicians, number theorists, computer scientists, historians, and so forth, talking about the implications of the paper 90 years on. That'll be in September. And we're just launching. Not all the detail is up there at the minute, but if you're very technically adept, you'll be able to find most of it by following the links through on the website. Come on, this is designed to appeal to you lot. Build your own Turing machine, you know, you're gonna have some fun. So you can interpret it in whatever way you want. What I'd particularly like you to do, as well as bring in your own engine. I know some of you've got them lurking in your attic. You built one 20 years ago and you've been too scared to tell your friends that that's what you did. I know. What I'd really like you to do, think about schools and colleges that you have connections with, either through your kids or your grandkids. Think about how we can get kids into technology and thinking about things in an electromechanical or a purely mechanical engineering-y kind of way, to think about computing from a different angle from what they're used to as 21st century youngsters. And I think that that's what will make the Build Your Own Turing Machine challenge really interesting, is to have lots of entries from schools and colleges. I think that would be just cool. So if you can think about how we can promote that, you can find out details from the museum's website. You can contact me and I'll help you make those connections. All right, finally, last piece of shameless promo. Roger was kind enough to say that he likes my books. Here's your payment. Have you seen one of those before? It's a non-legal tender 50p piece that went out of circulation about 100 years ago. Okay, so some of these are at the back. They're little leaflets that tell you a little bit more about some of the books. Okay, fine, I'm done. And Delwyn is going to put the microphone on so that we can take questions. But I have to wait for his cue.
Hey, I think we'll be able to hear. Go for it.
About the women, Emily Anderson was actually an academic. She was at College in Galway, somewhere in Ireland. She's Irish. She was a professor in Ireland. She recruited at the about 1922 or something.
You've read the bio. Yeah, the bio is really good. I didn't write it.
So she's one of the few women who's actually also an academic.
Yeah. So Emily Anderson, the most
amusing factoids that I came across about Emily Anderson. It's when somebody grumbled in the middle of World War II, she was leaving the office at 5 p.m. sharp. You know, everybody else says, don't you know there's a war on, kind of thing. And she says, what you need to understand is that my real work starts when I leave the office. What does she mean by that? She was actually famous in her lifetime for having done two extraordinary things, both of which involved an element of codebreaking. She wrote the translated, edited version of Mozart's letters, which was published around about 1940, you may remember, early 40s. Mozart's handwriting was absolutely terrible. And so there was sort of an element of trying to work out what on earth this was about. So, and this was a huge scholarly work. After World War II, she started on Beethoven's correspondence. If Mozart's handwriting was difficult, Beethoven's was just all over the place. She got given a medal by the West German government for her work on Beethoven in 1956, I think. So her real work started when she left the office. The only reason she came into the office was to get paid so that she could actually do what she considered to be her real work. She was, you're absolutely right. She was a scholar. She did code breaking as a sort of just a it's a side hustle. She wouldn't have understood the word. But anyway, there we go. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Emily Anderson.
Emily Anderson.
Before there was Bletchley Park and before there was the National Museum of Computing, we had the first reunion, the Parkies.
Yes.
And the man from GCHQ stood on the stage and gave them absolution to talk to us. Would they talk to us about what they did? They'd talk about the social life. They'd talk about how they got into Bletchley Park, but very little about what actually happened. And to a certain extent, I kind of see that as a reflection of the Monty Python sketch, the joke to make the Germans die laughing, because nobody could see the whole joke. And it was very, very compartmentalized.
Yeah.
Well, nobody knew what was happening in the hut next door. Nobody knew what was happening in the room next door.
So this is quite interesting. Forgive me. I'll try not to be more than 30 seconds on this one. But in the House of Commons, when he was Foreign Secretary, which dates it to about 1977, I should think, David Owen stood up because there was all this brouhaha about GCHQ, which you weren't supposed to be able to spell, you weren't supposed to have heard of it. Of course, all the newspapers were writing about it on a daily basis. Bletchley Park, you weren't supposed to have heard of it, you weren't supposed to have known about it, except that Winterbottom had written his book. And there was all these people banging on the door saying, if you let Winterbottom write this trash, then you ought to let us write something, you know, a bit more sensible. David Owen stood up in the House of Commons and said, look, here's the thing. All these people have signed the Official Secrets Act. They're all bound for the rest of their lives by the Official Secrets Act. But there's a sort of an executive kind of thing. We will make it something we will not prosecute people. It's a sort of like a no action letter. And we will not prosecute people if they write memoirs about the facts that they were at Bletchley Park and what it was like there, what the other people were like there and who they met there. That's all okay. But what you can't do is talk about the detail of codebreaking. So I think, and I haven't heard anything since then, you haven't been looking very carefully for it, that has made that no action letter lifted even to a greater degree. So even if you think that David Owen had the authority to say that, and then it actually meant anything, if you just stand up on your hind legs and say nonsense on the floor of the House of Commons, which people do every day, apparently, and you know, that sort of somehow has binding legal effect. I mean, who knows? So I can see why some people still believe that the fact that he's done it and she's done it and he's done it and he's done it and he's done it doesn't really give permission for me to do it unless somebody comes along and sort of actually says, no, the Official Secrets Act's been repealed, then I'm still bound.
I think that there was another point that Tony Sale did say that he wasn't allowed to run actual wartime programs on Colossus, because they were just getting to the end of the number crunching encryption setup at the point at which he finished the Colossus replica.
One
It was
does,
only later that he got to run the real stuff.
it does rather worry one, does it not, to believe that the UK government still perceives that the technology involved in Colossus might be something of involving national security all these years after. We are still dependent on 1940s technology for our own security. I hope not. Yeah, I mean, I think the attitudes have changed rather a lot now, and GCHQ and HMGCC are much more willing to talk about the past. Of course, they're not going to talk about current stuff. They wouldn't, but perhaps a little bit more maturity over this. GCHQ have told me that it's now their policy that everything from the World War II era should no longer be classified. There are some oddities around that which we can talk about, but I mean that's their policy, which is it's kind of helpful. They need to make that a rolling, a rolling cutoff, which they haven't yet had to do. Probably too expensive, frankly. Who's next?
A question from online. Simon Ray is asking, how much were the men and professors paid in comparison to the women? I'm assuming.
Yes, there's no single answer to this question because, of course, things changed as the war moved on, and they kept reshuffling the pay grades. But broadly, the men of the professor type were brought in on the senior assistant pay scale, which was roughly, and I'll get the numbers slightly wrong, but this gives you the rough idea, between 600 maybe for the top guys, maybe £700 a year. The junior assistants would typically be capped out at £400 a year. By the time you get to the end of the war, the pay grades have changed quite a lot, but we're talking about probably the topmost pay being in the region of £700 a year. Might the odd one who's paid a bit more than that. But you'll find there's quite a lot of women now coming into the codebreaking grades, and they'll be being paid typically on the same scale as men, but a notch or two lower. So, for example, when Dale was hired as one of the senior group of codebreakers, he wasn't paid at parity with the men, even though she was doing, well, of course, we didn't have Equal Pay Act in those days. So if you're going to pay men this much, then you have to pay women a bit less. And of course, that suits people like Denniston because he has his budget freed up. He can hire an extra person. If he's paying Miss Dale £200 a year less, that's an extra £200 in the budget that he can hire a couple of clerical assistants. Yeah.
Nina Baker online had some interesting observations. So I assume her experience at RAE. Nina, if you're listening, if you'd like to unmute and talk about it, or I can read it out if not.
Well, I was basically just making the point that the RAE ran a constant barrage of constant campaign really to try and get appropriate pay for their women. Very much like what you were saying, it's there's folders of letters in the National Archives of directors of this and that department saying, for God's sake, we've got to keep this woman. Yes, I know she's married, but let's not talk about it. Or how can we pay this other woman a bit more, even though we can't give her the male grade? Yeah. just the same.
Yeah, well, I'm not old enough to have witnessed World War II myself, as some of you may realise. But I do recall quite clearly when I was a kid, my mum, who was a primary school head teacher, would once a term roughly be hosting a retirement party, one of her young teachers. 23-year-old young women retiring, not because anybody had sacked them, but because it was still the social expectation that when you got married, then you would leave your job and you would take on a new role, which was to do with being, you know, in that being a housekeeper and the head of the domestic affairs of the family, and that was the expectation. Infant school teachers were not over 25. I mean, they just weren't. So there were these really odd pictures of these retirement parties of all these. I mean, you can imagine this in the 1960s of all these girls in miniskirts and long shiny boots having a retirement party. It's just completely bonkers. It looks like a student disco.
I think, well, I mean, at the RAE, they did their damnedest to keep people if they possibly could. And I think it would only have been the lower of the genuinely sort of lower clerical secretarial staff that happened to. And you read it in the RAE news that that's exactly what you just said. But the more technical people didn't.
Please.
So I can just ask you, when did all that change? When were the married people allowed to be married?
Well, it changed at different points according to which industry you're looking at, but the civil service was perceived to be in the sort of forefront of social engineering and therefore ought to have been the first mover on this. And to some extent it was. They're probably driven by things like the London County Council, which probably got there a bit faster than the behemoth of the sort of, you know, full civil service. But essentially, by the time you get to the end of World War II, the marriage bar has gone as a thing that's in the civil service regulations. You've still got this social conditioning thing, and you've still got private employers saying that if you work for my company and when you get married, then you have to be fired. And, you know, you've got the trade unions, sort of particularly the male-dominated trade unions, breathing hell at management to say, no, you've got to fire all these women because you're freeing up jobs for men. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. I mean, so it requires social change to sort of bring this stuff back. But so I haven't studied when it really came to an end. But I mean, does anybody recall the marriage bar still being in effect when they started work? I mean, I'd
say late 70s, 80s, personally.
Sorry, a totally different point. It's interesting to note that one of the clerical staff was particularly designated as established.
Oh, yes.
Because in the run-up to the Second World War in the 1930s, there were advertisements for houses in the London area, you know, the sort of suburban expansion. And one of the points is that established civil servants need no deposit whilst paying for your £300 house.
Quite interesting. So what does established mean? So established means that you are eligible for a pension when you reach pensionable age. Or if you are a woman and you do this getting married thing, which means we have to fire you, then you will get your marriage gratuity. It's actually sensible to do that because you've got a lot more money from, I mean, you can do the calculations, whatever it is, 380 once or something times final salary. But you know, the chances were that your marriage gratuity, which was also based on number of years served but had a different multiplier, was going to be more generous than if you stuck the course and retired at 60, whatever it is. So, so established is all that meant was that those things. So non-established civil servants were not eligible for this stuff, but essentially that meant that they were on a much more sort of precarious footing in terms of their employment. Oh, I'll take you, Dick, first, and then I'll come to you. Right.
Thank you.
It's only because he's closer and he might hit me if I'm first.
The experience you described about teachers was once talked about by, I think, a Minister of Education in the early 60s. He talked about the process of teacher training. And it was the Passchendaele approach. You brought lots and lots of women into the field only to be mowed down by marriage and pregnancy.
Well, there we are. Okay. Yeah, please.
Sorry, you mentioned self-publication. I don't mean self-publicise, but certainly not self-publicise, but talking about low pay. I haven't been on very good pay for quite a long time. I say very, very high pay for quite a long time. It's not bad recently. If anyone would like to talk to me about job opportunities or pay opportunities. Secondly, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how many of you get the regular. I say the same NHS that a lot of people experience in this country. But having experienced the very best of the NHS and complete denial of service from the NHS, I was just wondering if. Well, I'd like to speak to someone with that who could give me a health plan as well.
We seem to have come a fair way from the emergency list. So
Yeah, we have a few more. I'll just rattle through a few observations quickly. Our chairman, Chris Rees, says that this issue of having to resign upon marriage happened to a former girlfriend of his in the 1960s, royal household, no less. Emily is
headed by a woman at the time. Do you have to resign on getting married? I don't seem to think so. That's interesting. So
Emily's listening.
Abdicate on marriage. There's an interesting thought. Yes. Sorry.
Emily is listening at home with her 6-month-old daughter by her side, planning to return to work in engineering soon. And the information about the marriage bar has blown her mind. So rightly so.
So those of you who want to follow this up, I mean, I skipped over this slightly on one of my slides, which had a picture of Ray Strachey. I was fearful about overrunning with time, but I may now talk to you a little bit about Ray Strachey. Ray Strachey was married to Oliver Strachey, one of the World War I era codebreakers who picked up the baton after GC and CS was formed in 1919, broke codes all the way through right up to the mid part of World War II. His wife, of course, knew all about the goings on at the government code and cipher school, even though she didn't talk about it, but acted essentially as a channel for finding recruitment opportunities within the Oxbridge colleges for young women to get into code breaking. So she acted as a sort of liaison person throughout that. So she's interesting as part of this story anyway, but she's much, much more interesting because she was a women's rights activist in the 1930s. So having come from a suffragist family, she then picked up the whole business about equal pay and the marriage bar and wrote pamphlets, wrote books, gave evidence to various select committees and so forth about this, and managed to, not entirely successfully, debunk lots of the arguments being made by trade unionists and by men about why these things were fair and sensible and part of the social fabric, which we damaged at our peril. And I think what was quite interesting is at one point she actually managed to get the House of Commons to pass a resolution which scrapped the marriage bar and introduced equal pay. And then the Tories came back from the pub and said, "Oh my God, what's just happened?" and reversed it the next day. But so that was all quite interesting. She's a really interesting character, and she's got a biography as well out there. So anyway, so yes, do go and study this because it's good stuff.
One final thing, Joe Brody says Their boss makes Turing machines out of chocolate. That's quite interesting, and she gives them
Keep them in the fridge. If you're going to take them to the museum for exhibit, talk to the museum director about the maximum temperature in the room, because everybody else's Turing machines will be pumping out, glass kilojoules of heat into chocolate Turing machine will. Yeah, that would be good. Chocolate Turing. I like. As long as I get to take it home and eat.
Enough to go round.
Thank you for a wonderful afternoon. This is the last lecture of this session, so it's been closed in style, and we're very grateful to you for that. We resume the lectures on the 24th of September, which is actually the 4th Thursday, in order that we don't compete or overlap with your conference at TNMOC on the Computable 90. Thank you.
Computable 90.
So the program will be going up on the website as the various speakers confirm. We look forward to seeing you in the autumn. Have an enjoyable summer, and if you'd like to join me in thanking Dermot, we're excellent close to the year. Thank you, Dermot.
Thank you.